The gymnasium at Roosevelt High School smelled of sweat, old leather, and dreams deferred. Coach Miguel Santos stood at center court, watching his players run suicide drills in the sweltering Los Angeles heat. The ancient air conditioning had given out again, but he'd learned years ago that broken systems were just another obstacle to overcome, not an excuse to quit. At 43, Miguel had been coaching at Roosevelt for 15 years, long enough to see 3 generations of kids come through these doors. Some made it out of East LA to college scholarships and better lives. Others weren't so fortunate. The neighborhood had a way of claiming its own, pulling young men into cycles that seemed impossible to break. Today's practice felt different, though Miguel couldn't put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way 16-year-old David Morales kept glancing toward the exit, or how 15-year-old Carlos Vega had shown up with fresh bruises on his knuckles that he claimed came from helping his cousin move furniture. Miguel had been coaching long enough to know the difference between household injuries and street fights. The whistle around Miguel's neck felt heavier than usual as he called the team together. 15 boys, ages 14 to 18, gathered in a semicircle on the faded court. They came from apartments where 3 families shared space meant for one, from homes where electricity got turned off when parents chose between utilities and groceries, from streets where the sound of gunshots was as common as traffic noise. But here, in this gymnasium, with its peeling paint and broken scoreboards, they were just basketball players. Here, Miguel could teach them about teamwork, discipline, and believing in something bigger than the circumstances that surrounded them every day. "All right, listen up," Miguel said, his voice carrying the authority earned through years of caring more about these kids than they sometimes cared about themselves. "State playoffs start in 3 weeks. We've been working toward this all season. But basketball is just the vehicle. What we're really talking about is showing this city, this world, that Roosevelt High School produces champions." He looked each boy in the eye, a habit that had become second nature. Eyes told stories that words couldn't hide. They revealed who was hungry, who was afraid, who was carrying burdens no teenager should have to carry. "Coach," interrupted 17-year-old Javier Nunez, the team captain whose father had been deported 2 years earlier, leaving him to help support his mother and 3 younger sisters. "What if some of us can't make it to playoffs? What if other things get in the way?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that every person in that gym understood. Other things, family obligations that pulled kids out of school to work, immigration issues that made families disappear overnight, gang pressures that turned basketball players into soldiers in wars they never chose to fight. Miguel had heard variations of this question hundreds of times over the years. Early in his coaching career, he'd responded with speeches about priorities and commitment. Now, older and hopefully wiser, he understood that for many of these boys, survival trumped sports every single time. "Javier, let me tell you something I learned a long time ago," Miguel said, moving closer to his team. "Life is going to throw obstacles at all of us. The question isn't whether challenges will come. They will. The question is how we respond when they do. We can let circumstances define us, or we can use them to discover who we really are." Miguel's own story was written in the lines on his face, in the scars on his hands. 25 years earlier, he'd been sitting in the same gymnasium as a senior at Roosevelt, facing many of the same pressures his current players navigated daily. The difference was that Miguel had chosen basketball over the streets, college over quick money, and eventually returned to give back to the community that had shaped him. Not everyone understood his choice. His college roommate at UCLA had gone on to become a successful attorney in Beverly Hills, often asking Miguel why he stayed in East LA when he could coach at elite private schools or work in corporate youth development programs that paid 3 times his teacher's salary. The answer was simple, even if others couldn't see it. These kids needed someone who understood their world, someone who'd walked their streets and felt their pressures. They needed proof that escape was possible without abandoning your roots, that success didn't require forgetting where you came from. After practice, Miguel was locking up the equipment room when he heard voices in the hallway. He recognized David Morales talking to someone whose voice he didn't know, but whose tone carried the unmistakable authority of the streets. "Look, Primo, I told you we could use you. You got skills on the court, but this is bigger than basketball. This is family business. Miguel felt his stomach tighten. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. David was one of his most promising players, a junior with legitimate college prospects if he could stay focused. But David's older brother had been killed in a drive-by shooting 2 years ago, and his cousin Ramon had been pressuring David to step up and honor family obligations ever since. Miguel waited until the voices faded before leaving the school, but David's situation stayed with him during the drive home to his small apartment in Boyle Heights. He'd seen this scenario play out too many times. Talented kid faces pressured to choose between sports and streets, makes the wrong choice, and ends up another statistic in a city that seemed to consume its young men faster than it could nurture them. That night, Miguel called his mentor, Coach Raymond Williams, who'd coached at Roosevelt for 30 years before retiring. Coach Williams had been the one to see potential in Miguel when others saw just another kid from the neighborhood. The one who'd convinced him that college was possible, that coaching was a calling worth pursuing. "Ray, I've got a situation," Miguel began, explaining David's circumstances and his own concerns about losing another player to the streets. Coach Williams listened quietly before responding. "Miguel, you remember what I used to tell you about planting seeds? That you plant them not knowing which ones will grow, but you keep planting because you believe in the harvest." "That's right. And you remember what else I told you?" Miguel smiled despite his worry. "That sometimes the seeds you plant don't bloom for years, but when they do, they can save not just one life, but generations." "David's going to make his own choice, son. All you can do is make sure he knows he has options, that someone believes in him, and that there are people willing to fight for his future, even when he can't fight for it himself." The next morning, Miguel arrived at school early and waited by David's locker. When the boy showed up, he looked tired, like he'd been up all night wrestling with decisions no 16-year-old should have to make. "David, walk with me," Miguel said, not waiting for an answer. They went to the empty gymnasium, where the morning light streaming through high windows cast long shadows across the court. Miguel picked up a basketball and began dribbling slowly, the rhythmic sound echoing in the silence. "You know, when I was your age, I sat right over there," Miguel said, pointing to the bleachers, "trying to figure out if I was going to accept a scholarship to UCLA or stick around here and help my family with some business opportunities that seemed more immediate." David looked up with surprise. He'd never heard Coach Santos talk about his own past in such personal terms. "What did you do?" "I chose college, and for a long time, I felt guilty about it. Felt like I was abandoning my family, my neighborhood, my responsibilities. Some people in the community called me a sellout, said I thought I was better than everyone else." Miguel stopped dribbling and held the ball, looking directly at David. "But you know what I learned? The best way to help your family, your community, is to become the best version of yourself. When you succeed, you don't just change your own life. You change what's possible for everyone who comes after you." David was quiet for a long moment, scuffing his shoes on the worn court. "Coach, it's not that simple. My cousin, he says family comes first. He says my brother would have wanted me to step up, to represent for the family name." "David, let me ask you something. If your brother was here right now, what do you think he'd want for you? Really?" The question hit David like a physical blow. Miguel could see the boy's composure cracking, years of suppressed grief and pressure, finally finding a crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. "He'd want me to be better than him," David whispered, tears beginning to flow. "He always said basketball was my ticket out, said he made his choices, but I could make different ones." Miguel put his hand on David's shoulder, feeling the weight of all the young men he'd tried to save over the years, the ones he'd succeeded with and the ones he'd lost. "Then honor your brother by being who he knew you could become. Honor your family by showing them there's another way to represent strength and loyalty, through achievement, through education, through using your gifts to lift others up instead of tearing them down." The conversation continued for another hour, Miguel sharing stories of former players who'd faced similar crossroads. He talked about Marcus Rivera, who'd gone on to become a teacher and now coached at a school in San Diego. About Antonio Valdez, who'd earned an engineering degree and returned to East LA to start a nonprofit that provided tutoring and mentorship for at-risk youth. But he also talked about the ones who'd chosen differently. About Roberto Martinez, who'd been just as talented as any college prospect, but had gotten pulled into gang life during his senior year and was now serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. About Luis Hernandez, who died in a drive-by shooting just 3 months after graduation, his college acceptance letter still pinned to his bedroom wall. The choice is always yours, David. But remember, you're not just choosing for yourself. You're choosing for your future family, for kids in this neighborhood who need to see that success is possible, for your brother's memory and what it will represent. Over the next several days, Miguel watched David carefully, looking for signs of which direction the boy was leaning. David continued coming to practice, but he was distracted, going through the motions without the intensity that had made him such a promising player. Then on a Thursday afternoon, Miguel got the call he'd been dreading. David had been arrested in a gang sweep, picked up with his cousin and several other young men during what police described as a planned retaliation for a shooting the previous week. Miguel drove to the juvenile detention center, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he navigated traffic and his own anger. Not anger at David, anger at a system that made 16-year-old boys feel like they had to choose between loyalty and opportunity, at circumstances that turned children into soldiers, at his own inability to save every kid who walked through his gymnasium doors. The detention center was a sterile building that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. Miguel had been there too many times over the years, visiting players who'd made wrong choices at crucial moments. Each visit felt like a small failure, a reminder that caring wasn't always enough. David looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, younger than his 16 years. His eyes, which had been so full of potential just weeks earlier, now carried the hollow look of someone who'd realized that some choices couldn't be undone. "Coach, I'm sorry," David said before Miguel could speak. "I know I let you down. I let the team down." Miguel leaned forward, speaking quietly but intensely. "David, you haven't let anyone down yet. This is a mistake, but it doesn't have to define your life. You still have choices to make." "Coach, you don't understand. My cousin, he says if I cooperate with the police, if I tell them I wasn't really involved, then I'm betraying the family. But if I don't cooperate, I'm looking at serious time in juvenile detention, maybe even adult court." Miguel had seen this scenario before. Kids caught between street justice and legal justice, both systems demanding loyalty that came at devastating costs. "David, let me tell you what I understand. I understand that you're 16 years old and you're scared. I understand that you feel trapped between impossible choices. But I also understand that you have people who believe in you, who are willing to fight for your future even when the situation looks hopeless." Miguel had already contacted a lawyer he'd worked with before, someone who specialized in helping kids navigate the juvenile justice system. He'd also reached out to David's mother, offering whatever support the family needed during this crisis. "Here's what we're going to do," Miguel continued. "We're going to fight for you legally, academically, and personally. We're going to show the court that you're a student athlete with college potential, that this arrest is an aberration, not a pattern. We're going to demonstrate that you have a support system ready to help you succeed." Over the next 6 weeks, Miguel orchestrated a campaign to save David's future. He organized character witnesses from teachers who testified to David's academic improvement. He brought in college recruiters who expressed continued interest in David's basketball potential. He coordinated with social workers to address the family pressures that had contributed to David's situation. Most importantly, he got David into counseling sessions that helped the boy process his grief over his brother's death and develop strategies for handling family pressure without compromising his own future. The legal process was complicated and stressful, but eventually David was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling rather than detention time. The condition was that he maintain his grades, continue with basketball, and stay out of any further legal trouble. David's return to the team was emotional for everyone involved. His teammates had struggled without him, losing 3 games they might have won with their star player on the court. But more than basketball games, they'd lost faith in the idea that hard work and dedication could overcome street pressures. "Listen up," Miguel told his team on David's first day back. "We're all going to face moments when we have to choose between what's easy and what's right, between what other people expect of us and what we know we're capable of becoming. David made a mistake, but he's here because he chose to fight for his future instead of giving up on it. Miguel looked around the circle of young faces, seeing his own story reflected in their struggles and aspirations. That's what champions do. They get back up after they fall down. They learn from their mistakes instead of being defined by them. They use their second chances to become better than they were before. The team rallied around David's return, but Miguel knew the real test would come when they faced street pressures outside the gymnasium. Basketball could teach discipline and teamwork, but it couldn't eliminate the poverty, family obligations, and social pressures that made gang involvement seem logical to desperate teenagers. That's when Miguel made a decision that would change not just his coaching approach, but his entire life philosophy. He decided to expand his influence beyond the basketball court to create a comprehensive support system that addressed the root causes of why kids made destructive choices. Working with community organizations, local churches, and former players who'd succeeded in college and careers, Miguel developed what he called the Roosevelt Family Network. It was an informal but powerful system of mentorship, academic support, job training, and crisis intervention that surrounded his players with alternatives to street life. The network included former gang members who turned their lives around and now worked as counselors and mentors. It included college students who returned to provide tutoring and college prep support. It included employers who offered part-time jobs that allowed students to help their families financially without dropping out of school. Most importantly, it included families who'd learned to see education and athletics as pathways to success rather than distractions from immediate survival needs. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Miguel spent countless hours making phone calls, attending community meetings, and building relationships with people who could provide opportunities for his players. He used his modest teacher's salary to pay for college application fees, SAT prep courses, and sometimes even basic necessities like shoes and school supplies. His personal life suffered in the process. A relationship with a fellow teacher ended when she pointed out that Miguel's players seemed to get more of his time and attention than she did. He turned down coaching offers from better-funded schools because he couldn't abandon the kids who needed him most. But the results spoke for themselves. Over the next 3 years, Miguel's Roosevelt Family Network helped 22 young men earn college scholarships or technical training opportunities. More importantly, none of his players during that period were arrested or involved in gang violence. David Morales became the network's first major success story. He not only avoided further legal trouble, but emerged as a leader who helped other players navigate family and street pressures. His basketball skills improved dramatically as his life stabilized, and by his senior year, he was being recruited by several Division I colleges. The night before David's high school graduation, he approached Miguel after practice with something that looked like a formal letter. "Coach, I wanted you to be the first to know. I got a full ride to UC San Diego. 4 years, everything paid for. I'm going to study business and play basketball, but I also want to minor in social work." Miguel felt a familiar tightness in his throat, the same emotion that hit him every time one of his players achieved something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. "David, that's incredible. Your mother must be so proud." "She is, Coach. But I want you to know something else. I'm not going to college just for me. I'm going because I want to come back here someday and do what you do. I want to help kids like me understand that they have choices, that they don't have to let their circumstances define their futures." David paused, looking around the gymnasium that had been his sanctuary during the darkest period of his teenage years. "You saved my life, Coach. Not just from the streets or from jail, but from believing that I didn't deserve better than what I saw around me every day. You showed me that someone who looked like me, who came from where I came from, could succeed without forgetting where he came from." Miguel watched David walk away, knowing that his former player would indeed return someday to continue the work. That was how the cycle of change perpetuated itself, not through grand gestures or government programs, but through individuals who'd been helped deciding to help others. Over the next several years, the Roosevelt Family Network expanded beyond basketball to include other sports, academic clubs, and community service organizations. Miguel found himself working with girls as well as boys, with parents and siblings, with entire families who needed support systems to break cycles of poverty and violence. The work was exhausting and sometimes heartbreaking. For every David Morales success story, there were other kids who made different choices despite having access to support and opportunities. Miguel learned to celebrate victories without being crushed by defeats, to plant seeds without demanding immediate harvests. His reputation in the community evolved from the basketball coach to something more significant, a pillar of hope in a neighborhood that had learned to expect disappointment. Parents sought his advice on everything from college applications to family crises. Former players returned to volunteer with current teams, creating a network of mentorship that extended far beyond sports. The gymnasium at Roosevelt High School still smelled of sweat and old leather, but it also carried the scent of possibility. The ancient air conditioning still broke down regularly, but Miguel had learned that some of the most important work happened in imperfect conditions, with inadequate resources and unlimited heart. On a Friday afternoon in late spring, Miguel stood at center court watching his current team run drills. Among the players was David Morales' younger brother, a freshman who'd avoided the pressures that had nearly derailed David's future. In the bleachers sat several former players who'd graduated college and returned to help with practices, living proof that escape from poverty didn't require abandoning community. The whistle around Miguel's neck felt lighter these days, or maybe he'd just gotten stronger from carrying it. At 51, he'd been coaching at Roosevelt for 23 years, long enough to see some of his earliest players become parents who trusted him with their own children's futures. His phone buzzed with a text message from David, now in his second year at UC San Diego. "Coach, just got accepted to the graduate program in social work. Planning to do my internship in East LA next summer." The circle continues. Miguel smiled, thinking about Coach Williams's words about planting seeds and believing in harvests that might not come for years. He thought about all the young men who'd passed through this gymnasium, the ones who'd succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, and the ones who'd fallen short of their potential. Each one had taught him something about resilience, about the power of believing in people even when they couldn't believe in themselves. Practice ended, and Miguel gathered his team at center court for their usual closing ritual. 15 boys ranging in age from 14 to 18, connected by circumstances of birth, but united by shared dreams of something better. "Gentlemen," Miguel said, using the term that had become his signature way of addressing players, "I want you to remember something as you leave here today. You are not your zip code. You are not your family's mistakes or your neighborhood's reputation. You are not the labels that other people put on you or the limitations that poverty tries to impose." He looked each boy in the eye, a habit that had become sacred ritual. "You are young men with unlimited potential, with gifts that the world needs, with stories that deserve to be written on your own terms. Every choice you make, every day you choose education over shortcuts, every time you lift up a teammate instead of tearing down an opponent, you're proving that change is possible." Miguel paused, feeling the weight and privilege of this moment, of being trusted with the hopes and fears of another generation of kids who deserved every opportunity to succeed. The streets will always be there, trying to convince you that quick money is better than long-term success, that loyalty to the wrong things is more important than loyalty to your own potential. But remember this, real strength isn't about who you can hurt or intimidate. Real strength is about who you can help, who you can lift up, who you can inspire to believe in themselves. As the boys filed out of the gymnasium, heading home to apartments and challenges that would test everything Miguel had tried to teach them, he felt the familiar mixture of hope and worry that came with loving kids whose futures hung in the balance every single day. But he also felt something else: pride in work that mattered, satisfaction in planting seeds that would bloom long after he was gone, and gratitude for the privilege of spending his life proving that one person's belief in young people could literally change the world, one teenager at a time.